I know that America stands with Israel. I know that you stand with Israel. God bless the United States of America.
I'm not going to tell you about the 10 years of research that have gone into my trying to answer one single hard question, which is Israel and its U.S. lobby above the law in the United States? The Jewish agency led by David Ben-Gurion, and rather than do anything else, they set up a vast illegal smuggling network through an archipelago of nonprofit organizations that were there specifically to steal World War II surplus and channel it to Jewish fighters in Palestine. Some of the material was bought for cents on the dollar. Some of the material was stolen outright from the U.S. Marines in Hawaii, as was the case of Nathan Liff at 50 caliber machine guns. Materials and manpower for Palestine stole the entire list from the U.S. chaplain so that they could recruit more effectively in sending veterans of World War II to fight in Palestine. The Sonnenborn Institute, which was organized by a former Zionist Organization of America chair, was very effective in channeling via second and third countries all sorts of tank ammunition, aircraft, explosives, and was able to get it for pennies on the dollar, completely in violation of the Arms Export Control Act and all sorts of laws, including the Neutrality Act. They cared little about Americans shipping material inside of boilers, inside of mismarked boxes, dropping onto piers in New York. They didn't care about that because they had a higher purpose. That purpose was to win a state, and they were successful. If we look at some of the activities inside the Justice Department to cover up all of this, what you see is a very effective counterforce. Whenever the FBI was getting close, and there's a 7,000-page file in the National Archives with surveillance photographs of B-17s and materials and guns moving through the U.S. logistics system, what you would find is in the Justice Department's own files, lobbyists such as Abraham Feinberg, the uber lobbyist, cash bundling king, would assemble a war chest and mobilize people to quash prosecutions. They had 100 people they were going to arrest and prosecute on the West Coast alone. Never happened. There were only a handful of people who actually suffered any felony convictions, relatively low-level people. The big fish of the Jewish agency, Nahum Bernstein, writing the checks from New York, never indicted. And this was because there was a vast amount of influence over the president, a vast amount of access to the Justice Department Attorney General. One of the biggest problems in Pennsylvania right now is this. There is one plant that lost more highly enriched uranium, weapons-grade uranium, than any other nuclear fuel plant in the United States. It just happened to be run by two Zionist Organization of America officials, Ivan Novick and Zalman Shapiro, and a smuggler from the 1940s network of smuggling, David Lowenthal, who was very active with Israeli intelligence. And the amount of material unaccounted for today is 339 kilograms. They lost 2% of the entire throughput when Shapiro and the ZOA crew were in charge. It only went back down after they were forced out of ownership. What happened in the LBJ, Nixon, and subsequent administration, the record shows they were fearful of the political consequences of going after these people. Why are Israel lobbying organizations, which are closely coordinating with foreign principals and in some cases receiving money, able not to be as transparent as other organizations that are lobbying for foreign principle? Simple fact of the matter is, when ordered to register, they don't. They fight it. When forced to register, they undergo a transformation into something else and continue their operations. And there's no better case of that than the case that led to the creation of AIPAC. But first, the Zionist organization was ordered 7 times to register because it was a subsidiary of the World Zionist Organization. But they, according to Justice Department documents by underlings, got to the AG, who said, I'm not going to enforce the law. You don't have to register. You don't have to be transparent in your communications. They also got to the biggest attempt to register Israel lobbying groups in America, which was in the 1960s, when the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the Justice Department, concerned about overseas provocations dragging America into war, they cited in their chartering investigative document the Lavon affair twice. In other words, Israel twice as being provoking activities that would draw America into unwise overseas interventions. And so they decided to raid the Jewish agency, to raid the American Zionist Council, seize documents, and saw that they were bringing in money from the Jewish agency for public relations and for publicity. So what happened? Well, they were ordered by the Justice Department to register as foreign agents in 1962. The unincorporated lobbying division, however, split off 6 weeks later and is still with us today. That organization is called the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and it continues the work of the original American Zionist Council that was ordered to shut down under this FARA order. So in December, we had declassified documents of a counter-espionage investigation of the ADL. The ADL back in the 90s had been investigated for holding FBI and other classified documents in a campaign that they were launching against pro-Palestinian and anti-apartheid activists, 2 of whom died under mysterious circumstances. But what the memos once again reveal, if you read them online, is that there was an intervention at high levels. The record reveals that 2 high-ranking Israeli generals were dispatched to talk to Janet Reno. She dropped the case. The espionage investigation died. 2005, the same thing happened. 2 AIPAC lobbyists were indicted. They were using secrets to try to gin up a war with Iran. They were passing it to Glenn Kessler. Steve Rosen said he was trying to show that Iran was engaged in total war against the US in Iraq. And of course, the Obama administration and the judges involved didn't keep it in the system. So it's gotten to the point of ridiculousness.
Not only that Israel is no ally, but also that it is actually not a friend, because it does actual damage to the United States through using its considerable access to Congress and the media to promote policies that are good neither for the United States nor for Israel. But it is undeniably true that American officials extremely close to the Israeli government were behind the rush to war and the forgery of phony intelligence that fed the process. If the United States goes to war with Iran in the near future, it will not be because Tehran actually threatens America. It will be because Israel and its powerful lobby in the U.S. have succeeded in creating an essentially false casus belli to mandate such action. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who once commented that 9/11 was good for Israel, has repeatedly sought to commit our government to draw red lines that would narrow options for the White House and de facto require it to take action with the military against Iran. Congress is meanwhile advancing legislation that would commit the United States to intervene militarily in support of a unilateral Israeli attack, meaning that Israel could easily be empowered to make the decision on whether or not the U.S. goes to war. I also would not doubt that Israel, accustomed to behaving with impunity towards its alleged friend and patron in Washington, might manufacture a pretext to draw the U.S. into a new conflict. Something reminiscent of the Lavon affair in Alexandria, Egypt in 1954, or the false flag attack on the USS Liberty in 1967. Israel currently strongly supports using force to intervene in Syria, a proposition that is opposed overwhelmingly by the American public. In short, Israel has no reluctance to use its enormous political and media clout in the U.S. to pressure successive administrations to conform to its own foreign and security policy views. One other very good reason why Israel should not receive billions of dollars in military assistance annually is its persistent espionage against the United States. Grant Smith has described how Friends of Israel stole enriched uranium from a Pennsylvania refinery to create a nuclear arsenal. More recently, we have learned how Arnon Milchan, a Hollywood producer born in Israel, arranged for the illegal purchase of 800 nuclear triggers. Milchan picked up an Oscar last Sunday without any interference from the FBI. The existence of a large-scale Israeli spying effort at the time of 9/11 has been widely reported, incorporating Israeli companies in New Jersey and Florida, as well as hundreds of art students nationwide. 5 Israelis from one of the companies were observed celebrating against the backdrop of the Twin Towers going down. There were, for example, no consequences for the Israelis when Israeli Mossad intelligence officers, using passports and pretending to be Americans, recruited terrorists to carry out attacks inside Iran, as noted by Mark Perry this morning. Israelis using U.S. passports in that fashion put every American traveler at risk. More recently, FBI counterintelligence officer John Cole has reported how many cases of Israeli espionage are dropped under orders from the Justice Department. He provides a conservative estimate of 125 viable investigations into Israeli espionage involving both American citizens and Israelis that were stopped due to political pressure. So the answer to the question, is Israel an ally of the United States, is most definitely no. Is it even a friend? Well, I suppose there are all kinds of friends in the world, but if you judge Israel by its record on how it interacts with the American government and people, I think the answer would also have to be no.
It does demonstrate that the Israeli government, through its point man Jared Kushner, was engaged in collusion, was engaged in foreign meddling and subversion. And this, for some reason, is not the story, and we know why. Absolutely shocking that, I mean, and this has also come out through Mueller's investigation, is that Jared Kushner may have violated the Logan Act by conducting freelance diplomacy to work with the Israeli government to attempt to convince other governments to vote against the UN resolution, other governments on the Security Council. That's how we know that Kushner was the one who was encouraging Flynn to make this call. And it's just completely overlooked in Washington. It's overlooked by mainstream media, not only because of the fear of that very government and its cutouts in Washington attacking figures in the media and attacking public figures for daring to point to Israeli influence as a nefarious force that contravenes American interests, but because it's a matter of American policy to allow Israel to dictate our policy with respect to the Middle East, including in Syria. And so you have elements that are deeply embedded in the national security state that have been hostile to de-escalating the Syrian civil war. These elements, you could point to John Brennan from the CIA. One of his babies was the arm and equip operation to, train and arm Syrian rebels.
What does Israel really want? There's been some theory that Netanyahu has a lot of anti-Iranian rhetoric as existential threat, but it's more for domestic political consumption. Or does he really want the United States to go after in a far more aggressive way and really go after Iran?
I think those two things are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Iran has been a very valuable domestic political card for Netanyahu. There is really no opposition to Netanyahu within the Knesset or within other parties in Israel in which they're taking a dramatically different position on Iran. At best, they would be criticizing Netanyahu and arguing that he has been reckless in the way that he's handled the issue because he got himself into too much tensions with the Barack Obama administration.